Representative Ferrari is still waiting for Senate committee hearings on her bill, but there's a competing Senate proposal scheduled for a Saturday discussion. It would raise the minimum wage to $10 instead of the $12 an hour in Ferrari's bill. Now, restaurants like it because it would keep the tip credit intact. It's been years since New Mexico has touched the minimum wage, but our cities and counties have been busy. Las Cruces, Albuquerque, and Santa Fe are among those that have chosen to boost their base pay rates. And across the country, other cities and states have done the same. That means wage experts like UNM's Melissa Bender have data to study that helps predict what impact the raising of the minimum wage might be. She sat down with correspondent Gwyneth Dolan this week.
Melissa Bender, thank you so much for being with us today. Much of the discussion in Santa Fe this year about the minimum wage seems to be about where to set it, at what level. Is it $10 an hour? Is it $12 an hour? How do we go about figuring out what rate is going to work best?
So one way to look at it is to see what it was historically and then adjust for inflation. And under that idea, you're trying to keep the purchasing power the same as it was in the past. And so if we look at 1968, for example, the minimum wage was $1.60, which doesn't sound like that much. But in purchasing power terms, it would be about $11.50 now. And so the numbers that people are talking about are pretty close to that historical purchasing power.
They've done that math already, haven't they?
I don't know if they did or not. Someone did it. Someone did the math.
Do you know what those numbers looked like in New Mexico historically?
Well, for most of, since the minimum wage has been in effect nationally, most of the states and New Mexico has just followed the federal. But what happens over time is that because it's not indexed to inflation, it just immediately starts losing purchasing power. And so, New Mexico now is 25 cents above the federal minimum wage, so pretty close. It is too bad, though, that when your producer called me to ask if I would speak on the show, I said, really, again? It's just that I'm old enough where I've seen this multiple times because every 10 years, the minimum wage becomes ridiculously low and it needs to be adjusted. And so there's an easy fix to that.
Oh, well, what is it?
If you just indexed it to inflation.
Right.
And Santa Fe and Albuquerque do that. And then you don't have to have this discussion over and over again.
So if they set it, you said $11.50 would track, right now, but if they pick a dollar amount, say they pick 12 and it's a little too high, what do we risk by setting it too high?
Well, I think a few 50 cents or even a dollar one way or another is not going to make or break it. There's a couple of ideas about why you set a minimum, and the most basic one is that you don't want workers to be exploited. You can always find someone who will work at a lower wage, but there should be a market clearing wage. And at that point, there would be about everyone who wanted a job would find one and so on. And so one indicator that the minimum wage is too low is if establishments that pay the minimum wage always have signs up that they're hiring. That's an indication that there aren't enough workers who are willing to work at that wage. And it's interesting, too, because it's not just anyone is free, obviously, to pay above the minimum wage, but it sets a norm. It really does. And I think it's saying what labor is worth, and it's a signal. And large companies and small companies, too, they don't want to necessarily pay more because they want to try to find those workers at that norm. I think it's really an interesting idea.
I just saw Amazon, Amazon set its minimum wage at $15 an hour across the board. There's a PR element to it there, There's we want to appear to be a company that cares, even if they aren't necessarily.
Right. Well, and also, the arguments about it being too high and then there not being enough people employed, which I can tell you more about what the research says about that. But humans are not, labor is not the same as other things that we buy. And so there's something about the value of labor that really makes it different. And I think that's why this is a more emotional kind of discussion than other kinds of at least this is an economic issue. A lot of economic issues are snooze land. This one is more interesting.
People get quite passionate about it. You know, they say, well, you know, it's just the minimum wage. This isn't meant to be a career. These aren't people who do this their whole lives. They're teenagers. Is it all teenagers who make the minimum wage?
Actually, no. So according to statistics that I just looked up, about 20% of the minimum wage workers are teenagers, 16 to 19, and then about half are over 25. And so there are definitely people who can spend their whole lives at the minimum wage. There's no question about that.
We haven't upped the minimum wage here since 2009. You know,
See, every 10 years.
every 10 years, you're right. And I think your argument is if you index it to inflation, you don't have to keep coming back to this every 10 years. But how do other states do it? Are there states that are doing it very well?
So I actually am not that familiar with what other states are doing. Like I said, the city of Albuquerque and the city of Santa Fe have done the indexing. I remember Mitt Romney, when he was running for president, said that he wished that as a small businessman it had been indexed because it would reduce uncertainty. And so I think that that's a really common sense way of addressing this problem.
Yeah. So $10 an hour, if that's where we're going in Santa Fe, is very different than $10 an hour in other communities in terms of purchasing power in one way in particular. And talking about Albuquerque and Santa Fe, is it a problem when cities do things differently from the state or from other communities? Does that create uncertainty and chaos? Is it too difficult for everyone to follow?
So I haven't noticed too much chaos in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. I don't think that that's really a problem, and it makes sense because, like you said, the cost of living is higher in cities than it is outside of cities.
So good policy, are you saying, would be to continue to let cities choose their own?
I don't see any reason why you would restrict cities from doing that.
So but we should raise it at the state level, at least to the index to inflation rate.
That's what I would recommend.
So moving forward, what do you think are some of the best practices from an economist's perspective when municipalities or states are looking at handling minimum wage? What are some of the things that we should keep in mind when we're looking at it?
Well, one rule of thumb that actually comes from the World Bank is that you want to be at about half of the median average hourly wage in the private sector. That seems to be a number that doesn't, I mean, you can have a minimum wage that is too high. In the 1980s and 90s, a lot of countries in Latin America had really high minimum wage. Actually, one of them is Venezuela. No one got paid it. It was just way too high, and so it was just widely ignored. I think another indication that the minimum wage is reasonable is that it's actually people follow the rules.
I'm going to have to stop you there. If people follow the rules, then it's working. That is a great point.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.